Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in tonight. As most of you know, my father passed away on the 4th of July. I am in Illinois taking care of affairs and getting things set and ready here. I did not have a chance to do new episodes this week, and I wanted to give you something for those of you that watch the Paranormal 60 you haven't seen. So I did an interview a couple months back with Joe Franke of the Warren Legacy Foundation. So tonight we're going to talk about Ed and Lorraine Warren, their legacy, and what it meant, all the work that they did, and what continues to be done in their name. So I hope that you'll enjoy it. Next Monday, I will have a special edition of the episode Paranormal 60, and it will be one more episode from my Paranormal 360 radio show. It will be an hour long for you, but it will be stories. It is kind of theater of the mind stories done in the vein of old radio shows. I wanted to do something a little fun and different for my radio program. And although there is no video with it, there will be audio and some slides that will air Monday. My hopes and desires are to be back with you all live next Wednesday. Thank you so much for your understanding, the compassion, the love, the amazing amount of emails and messages on social media and posts that you've made. I can't tell you how much it means to me and my family. So thank you very much. Sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's episode of the Paranormal 60 360 edition.
I'm not gonna stand here and listen to this baloney. You won't know. He doesn't stand for baloney.
Sounds like a lot of supernatural baloney to me.
Supernatural, perhaps. Baloney, perhaps not.
Tonight, he's one of the last active investigators who worked side by side with Ed and Lorraine Warren, with over 4 decades of experience confronting the darkest corners of the paranormal. Joe Franke has seen the toll spirits, curses, and demonic forces can take on the living. From poltergeist to possession, occult rituals to haunted relics. He's not just a witness. He's been in the trenches. And now he's using that knowledge to educate and protect a new generation. So get ready, Darklings. We're cracking open the real case files and exploring the dangerous side of the supernatural with the founder of the Warren Society for Paranormal Research and Education. Joe Franke joins me on the John Schuster Coldwell Banker Hotline right here on the Paranormal 360. Joe, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
This is interesting. I've been so lucky through my long storied career of radio to have been able to interview Lorraine 4 or 5 times. I have talked to John Zaffis for years. I've spoken to people that were part of the investigations that Ed and Lorraine were a part of, but it's great to actually get to chat with somebody, boots on the ground, worked side by side, elbow to elbow with them, and hear some of the different perspective on this. And for our audience, just so they can get caught up, what is the Warren Society for Paranormal Research and Education?
Well, basically, it's a labor of love, Dave. It's something that I've always wanted to do. I mean, I've been continuing the work of Ed and Lorraine on my own for many, many years, but myself, along with some good friends and colleagues, have decided to join together and launch this society, which it's still in the works. The website's still under construction, but you know, it's like I said, it's just a group of seasoned professionals from all walks of life, and you don't have to necessarily be a paranormal investigator, so to speak. You know, we have doctors, lawyers, financial people, psychologists, psychic mediums, demonologists, priests, what I call spiritual advisors, from all walks of life. So we try to get all the bases covered, and I'm doing this very methodically to make sure that I have all my ducks in a row, all my I's dotted and T's crossed. But it's newly formed. It's like I said, it's something I've always wanted to do to honor my mentors and people who are family to me. They were like my grandparents, and it's come full circle for me because I'm the age now that Ed and Lorraine were when I met them as a young 18-year-old out of high school, fresh out of high school. So, the society, as I said, it's a labor of love. There's no charge for helping people, never is. We survive on donations. Hopefully we'll get some donations so we're able to do the work. Otherwise it comes out of pocket.
Right.
Answer to my wife for that. But like I said, this was a vocation for me. It's not an occupation.
So the research and education aspect of this is you're still an active investigating paranormal team, but
Yes.
you're also there to educate people about the paranormal and what's going on out there.
Right. When coming up with a title for the organization, I wanted to make sure to honor Ed and Lorraine. I wanted to keep their name in it, but I also wanted to add the word education.
Mhm.
Now, I've been doing this for 40 years now. I don't know everything. I don't profess to know everything, but I know quite a bit. My good friend, John, you mentioned John Zaffis. He and I have been friends for 40 years. He's kind of a mentor to me.
Mhm.
If I have issues, I'm working a tough case or something, I give John a call. And then he'll accompany me on a case, especially if it turns out to be something that may be demonic. I've got some health issues. I have to be careful.
Right.
I'm not Superman. I'm not walking around with a big S on my shirt and a big red cape. I'm just a mortal human being, and I have to be smart about it. But the education piece is I just want to share my knowledge that I've learned over the years with the next generation of researchers. Those that will listen. So I do attend, do a lot of lecturing around the country. I do some paracons, colleges, universities, a lot of public libraries, even a lot of fundraising events. And, I talk to the general public and some would-be investigators that may be in the audience. I just tell them, look, don't be offended by anything I may say here. I was once where you are right now, and I just want to pass on that work, that education to those that are up and coming.
All right. Well, let's get into a little bit of your story. You said that you connected with them when you were around 18 years old. What brought you into the sphere of influence of Ed and Lorraine Warren?
Well, I love to tell this story. It's a great story. When I was a teenager, I was 18 years old. I was just dating my wife at the time. We've been married now, come 33 years in May, but we've been together for almost 40. And so when we were dating, I remember Laurel came to me. She saw in the local newspaper that Ed and Lorraine Warren were going to be lecturing about one town over. And she's like, I don't want to go to the movies again. I always go to the movies. Back now, I'm talking 1986. I mean, we didn't have the internet back then. You go roller skating or rollerblading or go to the movies. So we ended up going down to see the Warrens lecture. And I fondly recall as I was walking up to the table, Lorraine was at the table there, meeting and greeting and selling the tickets. And she looked at me and she kind of cocked her head to the side and she's looking at me like you look at somebody like, where do I know this person from? I can't picture the name. And she said, honey, we met before. And she called everybody honey. She was such a sweetheart.
Yeah.
And I said, no, Lorraine. I said, I've heard a lot about you. I've seen you on television. I knew the cases, the Amityville case and the Annabelle and the Harrisville haunting. I said, but I've never been to one of your shows. We've never met. And she says, there's a reason why you're here tonight. She says, make sure you come and see Ed and I after the show. So I'm like, okay, sure. So I was very excited. We get through the show. The end of the show, Lorraine was so sweet. She'd be answering everybody's questions and Ed's packing up. Come on, Lorraine, let's go. I'm hungry, And, Tony was there, their son-in-law. And so we went to a diner right down the street. And I was sitting across from her at the diner and she was holding my hands. And what she was telling me, she explained to me what she was doing. She was reading my aura. Lorraine had the ability to read auras, that supernatural glow that emanates from every one of us. And she said, honey, I can tell by your aura that you were meant to do this work. That's why you came tonight. You were brought here tonight. And she said, would you like to come and work with Ed and I? We're forming some classes. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I was in. I was all in, And so from there, they used to have these classes in a little place called Hawley Manor in Newtown, Connecticut. And the room that we used to meet in, it was Monday nights from 7 to 9, wasn't much bigger than a coat closet. And there was 6 of us, including my girlfriend, who was, my wife and I. And that's where Ed would come in with this box under his arm, and he had like his tape recorders with his tapes and his notes, and he'd bring in a VCR and a little TV. And that's where I started to first learn about some of the more iconic cases, which became the iconic cases, such as Amityville and the Enfield Poltergeist and the Harrisville Haunting, which you guys all know now as the Conjuring house. And he would go over the notes, and he would play audio tapes and some videotapes, the exorcisms and things like that. And I was fascinated. I didn't know anything back then. I had chills, I had goosebumps, and so that's how I got started. But it was a couple of years before I was allowed to go on a case on my own. I would always accompany them, and that's how I learned. I would also double as their bodyguard at their lectures because you get some people that have a little bit too much liquid courage, and they would start heckling the Warrens, and it didn't happen a heck of a lot. But Ed would just look at me, Joe, you want to take care of this?
The paranormal enforcer, Joe Franke, my guest. We have to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll continue more. We've got a lot to discuss right here on the Paranormal 360. Welcome back to the program. Joe Franke talking to us about his indoctrination into the world of Ed and Lorraine Warren. But prior to going to see them, I understand you've heard about these cases living out in that area. It's hard not to hear about them. They were local celebrities. Had you had your own paranormal experiences, though, Joe?
It's funny you should ask that. I had, when I was a 3-year-old boy, what I call a divine experience. And I tell the story at my lectures because I don't know if there's really a connection, but this is how it started for me. I was named for my maternal grandfather. He was Joseph Martin Quinn. I'm Joseph Martin Franke, but he was very proud of that. And I was like his pride and joy. I barely remember him. Because I was so young when he passed. But my grandfather was a very religious man. I definitely believe he's a saint today, and he's always watching over me. But what happened was one night my parents were out watching Monday Night Football. It was a Monday night back in November of '71. I was 3.5 years old, and my parents had put us in bed. I remember I had bunk beds with my brother. My brother's 1.5 years older than me. And I was on the bottom bunk, and my parents are out watching football. I come running out into the living room. What, mommy? What? Somebody called Joe. Somebody called Joe. And my parents just kind of looked at each other and said, oh, he's having a dream. He's sleepwalking. She puts me back into bed. A couple of minutes later, same thing. I come out. What? My eyes are closed. I'm clearly asleep, just sleepwalking. And my mother tucks me in the second time, and the phone rings. It was my grandmother. She said, I can't wake up your father. What happened was my grandfather used to have a ritual. Every night before bed, he had an easy chair in his bedroom, and he would sit in his chair and read passages from the Bible. But many times he would fall asleep with the Bible on his lap. So my grandma was like, come on, Joe, wake up. We got to go to bed. Well, obviously he didn't wake up. What they believe happened is he fell asleep and had a heart attack in his sleep, and he passed away. And to this day, I have that Bible with me. I carry it on every case I go on. It's part of my tool bag, so to speak, like Felix the cat. But so what happened was I heard a voice calling my name, and I remember it like it was 5 minutes ago. I heard this voice in my dream calling my name, and what I feel that was God calling my grandfather. I had such a close bond with him that I believe that I could feel and see and hear this voice. I couldn't see anything. I remember a light and a voice, and that's it. And obviously, as I got older and my mother told me the story, I actually asked her to put it in writing for me because she passed a few years ago. And I do have it in writing in her own words of what exactly happened. But I call that a divine experience for me because I believe in my heart and soul that I heard the Lord calling my grandfather. And since we were so close, and I was so connected with him, I was treated to that experience. So fast forward 15 years to when I'm 18 is when I met the Warrens. Now, I'm not really sure if one has to do with the other, but that was a very impactful experience on me, and I'll never forget it. And like I said, when Lorraine looked at me, she said, honey, you were meant to do this work. I can tell by your aura. Of course, I believed her.
Right.
And here I am, 40 years later, I'm in my upper 50s and I'm still doing the work. still active.
When you settle in to start doing the training and you're with them for quite a while and you're seeing the case footage and hearing the audio and hearing them explain the situations as they occur, was there ever a point, Joe, where you were like, maybe I should just pick up stamp collecting? And because I would guess that hearing the stories firsthand, hearing their audio recordings and seeing the films, that has to be kind of frightening and intimidating. Because it's so real. Then it's not just something that's in a movie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It did scare me. I mean, I always tell people, at the end of the day, I'm a human being. I'm a mortal man. I'm no force to deal with these demonic forces and stuff like that. But more than scaring me, it intrigued me. I wanted to learn more. And Ed would call me up on a Saturday or Sunday and say, "Hey, kid, what are you doing today?" He always called me kid. "Hey, kid, what are you doing today?" "Oh, nothing, Ed. I'm going to cut the grass or whatever, paint the house." I said, "What do you need?" He goes, "Come down and meet me in my office. I want to go over some stuff with you." And, so I used to sit side by side with him in his office, and he'd go over the cases from some of the artifacts in the museum. I'd talk about, the Devil in Connecticut case, which happened back in 1980.
Right.
In 1980, I was only 12 years old. A lot of these cases were when I was a youth. Amityville, I was 6, 7 years old at that time. So, but I was intrigued by it, and of course, I got goosebumps. But at no point really in my life did I ever think this isn't for me. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to know more, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. I wasn't frightened, but it's a natural human emotion.
Right.
People that stand up and say, "Oh, I'm not scared. I'm not scared." No, you're lying to yourself. It's okay to be scared. You're human. But Ed used to have a saying, and he said, "Face your fears." He said, "Kid," he goes, "we got to help people face those fears and tackle their issues." And I always say faith and fear can't coexist, because if you're deeply rooted in your faith and it's unshakable, then you really have nothing to fear, and that's the message that I spread. A lot of the families we work with, I'm working on a new case now outside of Philadelphia. It's a husband and wife. They got 3 young children, 6, 3, and 2. And we believe it's a case of demonic oppression, because, they've got video footage of the children being pulled and tugged and arms twisted. And,
Wow.
So this is a reality that most paranormal teams will never experience. And I hope they don't. If I never I tell people demonic cases are very rare, and possession is rarer still. But if you watch TV or YouTube these days, you think that, there's a demon lurking around every corner. They don't want to be discovered. They want to stay in the shadows, and when you're using things like religious provocation to draw them out of the shadows, that's an area where, a lot of teams should not venture, unless you're educated.
I've spoken about
I don't even want to do it.
Yeah, for about 9 years, I've mentioned that. Probably closer to 19 years. A lot of people seem drawn to the darker side of the paranormal when it comes to investigating, because I don't know if they think they're just more badass or if it's the X Games of the paranormal. And I've warned people many times, this isn't a game. This isn't just you are a demonologist because you want to be. You have to have a calling for this. You have to know what you're doing and understand that this isn't a game and this isn't Hollywood. And what you're doing not only puts you into danger, but it can put people you love and care about in danger as well.
Yeah, I had a very good friend of mine I worked with for many years, and we had a pretty bad case we worked on, and he challenged it, and he wasn't prepared. He didn't prepare himself. I tell people, you need to be in a state of absolution or a state of grace.
Right.
And he wasn't, and he challenged it. And to this day, the poor guy has, I've got all kinds of problems. I'm talking psychological problems. He's got financial problems. He's got marital problems. It went after his children. And, you really got to prepare yourself for this, because you're right. It will go after those things that you love most, and it'll tear you down. Like I said, we're no match for these things. And when I see these YouTubers and these things on television, like, "Oh, if this is the gates of hell, why don't you rise up and grab me?" I'm like, oh my God,
Be careful what you're asking for. Joe Franke, our guest. We have to take a quick break. We'll come back and hear about some of the impactful cases that he did investigate. What was it like to step out from behind the shadow of Ed and Lorraine and into the realm of investigating? We'll do that next, right here.
Now, during the Halloween season, the veil between the worlds gets thinner and the chills get real. Oh, so very real. Something is waiting in the dark, and it's calling your name. So answer the call this Halloween season for the Paranormal 60 presents Halloween Haunts and Hijinks, October 9th through the 12th, for a supernatural weekend you'll never forget. It's being held at the historic haunted Palmer House Hotel in Sauk Center, Minnesota. Join Dave Schrader from the Holzer Files, Ghosts of Devil's Perch, and the host of the Paranormal 60 podcast. He's teaming up with Dalen Spratt from Ghost Brothers and Phantom Forensics. And we have heart-centered, intuitive Diet Renee for a weekend packed with spine-tingling experiences. You'll have 2 nights of live investigations and paranormal experiments, interactive workshops, gallery readings, and meet and greets, live presentations with experts themselves. This isn't just an event, it's a doorway to the unknown. So you have to ask yourself, do you dare cross it? Now, tickets are limited, so please book your Halloween Haunts and Hijinks adventure now at darknessevents.com. Again, that is darknessevents.com.
All right, Joe Franke, our guest, and we're going to get into the thick of it now. You've talked to us a little bit about your background. You've talked to us about how you connected with Ed and Lorraine Warren. They would fill you in on these cases, talk to you through it, show you the evidence, show you these stories, and then they invite you out into the field. Mm-hmm. And you start helping to investigate. Now, when you start this, I mean, are you getting thrown in the deep end of the pool, Joe, or are you basically the PA? Are you the one running to get their coffees and pick up some donuts, or, for them while they're doing the case, and you're on hand for an extra set of hands if they need you?
Well, no, I mean, Laurel and I had a very special relationship with Ed and Lorraine. They would come to our house for dinner a lot. We would go to their house, or we would go out. We formed a bond. I remember Ed said to me one day, kid, he goes, you're the grandson I always wish I had. He does have a grandson, my friend Chris, and he used to just tease Chris because sometimes they would butt heads, but I know he loved me, and Lorraine and my wife were very close. So it's almost like they have accepted me into their family. I remember fondly a year or two ago, I was at John's house talking, and he looked at me and goes, Joe, you're family. He goes, you're like a brother to me. And that really got me in the feels, because they really accepted me as a family member, and I would attend picnics at the house and dinners and things like that. So it wasn't just like I was just an investigator to them. I felt special. At least they made me feel special.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, in the beginning, when you're first starting to go, are you just right into it as being part of the family, part of the investigators, or are they keeping you still at a safe distance? So if things go wrong quickly, you're not in the crosshairs.
Well, I mean, the first thing it got me into was spirit photography, for example. Mm-hmm. I remember the first thing we ever did together was on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon to 2 p.m. We went to a cemetery to take photographs. Ironically, it's the same cemetery where they laid to rest, Stepney Cemetery in Monroe, Connecticut. And he was interested. He was easing me in. I'm sorry, I'm trying to answer your question. He eased me into it. But as time progressed, I would go on cases with him. I remember there was one case where I was actually attacked physically, and it was totally out of the blue. I wasn't expecting it. I was 350 pounds, 6'3", not scared of anybody except my wife, maybe, but, and we were at this house that was having issues, and I was thrown across the room. Like, wow. Ed was teaching me what he called religious provocation, use these holy relics or blessed objects to try to draw these things out of the shadows. And I was thrown about 12 feet like I was a rag doll. Again, I'm still a big guy, even though I'm an old man now, but I was a weightlifter, 350 pounds, and
But Joe, when you
didn't
say
know
you're thrown, did
Yeah.
it feel like physical hands picked you up and threw you? Did it feel like you hit a wall of energy? How can you explain that to me?
It felt to me like I was pushed and pulled at the same time. It was almost like a hurricane force wind, almost. And I went from here to there in a split second. And it had to have been 10 or 12 feet because I remember impacting the wall with my right shoulder and leaving a hole in the wall. And people were like, oh, I tell the story, and people are like, well, weren't you scared? I go, yeah, I was scared out of my mind. I couldn't process what just happened to me. But then I got up and I was pissed. I was pissed off. But that was my first introduction to something, and that had to have been something demonic. I mean, Casper the Friendly Ghost doesn't have that kind of power. But I've been punched, scratched, burned, bitten, like I said, thrown across the room. But that was the first time that had ever happened to me. And, and Ed was in the house. He was in another area of the house, and he comes out and he said, what just happened? And then the house shortly thereafter was successfully, I don't want to say exorcised. That's more for a human being, but it was cleansed. And the family moved anyway. The family was terrified. This was a family. You walk in the front door and all their belongings, everything they owned was in the living room. They didn't want to venture off to areas of the house, like divide and conquer kind of thing.
Wow.
When they were huddled together, they seemed to, or at least felt safe, But when they would wander, someone would go to the bathroom alone, they would have an experience in the bathroom where they couldn't open the door or whatever, or they'd see this grotesque face in the mirror. So what they used to do is when somebody would go to the bathroom, they'd leave the door ajar and then hold the hands of someone that's standing outside in the hall. Things like that. These people were terrified. So this is very, very real. And, today it seems that a lot of these groups make a mockery out of that. Like, it's like, oh, I wish that would happen to me, or I wish I could experience that. And I'm like, no, you don't.
Right.
You don't, be careful what you wish for,
When you're encountering a family that's this stressed out, this anxiety ridden, do you notice that, I know there's different levels of possession, right? You've got the infestation, you've got the oppression level, and that's where it's breaking you down. Yeah. And then, once you've kind of given in, that's when the possession can occur. But when you're talking to this family, how are Ed and Lorraine and Joe Franke navigating waters of sanity to know that who you're talking to isn't just some crazy family,
right?
But somebody, obviously, when you're getting thrown around, you're up against something. But before that moment happens, you're still taking them at their face value. How do you weed through the imaginations and the realities of that aspect?
Well, I remember Ed used to tell me, he's like, you want to interview the family separately to make sure their stories jive,
Right.
Obviously nowadays, one of the first questions I ask people is, how many of these TV shows do you watch, or do you watch them? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, oh yeah, we love this one. I'm like, well, stop. I said, stop watching these, because now it's psychosomatic. Now, not only the seed has been planted, but now you're watering it, and it's like, I ingest sometimes when I'm lecturing, so how many people have not seen the movie The Exorcist, which is actually based on a true story. And I go into the background of that story. But I said, how many people have watched it at 2:00 in the morning in the dark all by themselves, and then they go to bed and every little noise they hear, they think they got a demon in their house, because it's up here. So we would interview the families separately and together. Anyone that was involved or witnessed anything, like friends, neighbors, or whatever, coworkers, we would interview them and try to discern, okay, do you have a paranormal affliction, or is it just something that can be explained naturally? I said, always look for a natural solution or explanation rather than taking the nuclear option and jumping to supernatural. Like if you're hearing scratching noises, well, maybe you got raccoons in the attic or something. And these are things that we've found: squirrels, raccoons, rats, mice, or whatever. Look for a natural explanation for that, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. I've had people, I've had a husband and wife sit next to each other, and the husband, I'm like, I don't know, she's crazy. I don't experience anything. He said, well, that doesn't mean she's not experiencing something. It might be something that's meant for her. We could be sitting right next to each other and you'd have an experience and I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, because it was meant for that individual. So it's not easy to discern, but through the years, obviously through the knowledge and experience, I'm pretty good at discerning whether, this is just some kind of psychosis, or, maybe you watch too much TV, or maybe you do have a serious problem like this family out in the Philadelphia area. I'm working with some very gifted clergy. One of them is actually an exorcist, and we gave the family a lot of guidance and support. And I just talked to the woman the other night, and she said that, this through texting, she said that it's going dormant. Nothing's happening. I'm like, great. And I'm not going to come and kick the hornet's nest.
Right.
But I said, if there's something diabolic,
hold on 1 second, Joe. Sorry, we're going to go to another commercial break again. We'll come right back. We've got more with Joe Franke right after this. All right, Joe. I know time flies by on us quickly here.
It does.
Yeah, in this last 8-minute segment for the first hour, you were saying that the family that you're helping in Philadelphia, the haunting has settled down. It's gone dormant. Now, a lot of people, being out in the field, going to conferences, they'll keep going in to check just to make sure that nothing's going on. I like your concept of why poke the bear, right? Why go in and continually stir the hornet's nest? If it's going quiet, leave it be.
Well, let me tell you, I haven't even been to the house yet. I tell people the last thing you should do is do an investigation, especially if you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
But the last thing you should do is load up the mystery machine, grab Scooby-Doo, and head out there. That may not be necessary, and I'll tell you why. Because with the advice that we've given this family, and we've asked them, they are Catholic. Unfortunately, the children are not yet baptized, which is an issue, which is probably why they're being targeted, or at least one of the reasons. I did discover through investigating or through interviewing the family, a couple of doorways that were opened. I don't want to say any specifics, but there were some assaults and stuff like that. But it's an active case. I don't want to talk too much about it. But we gave the family a lot of advice. I said, this is what we want you to do. It was, Father Bob, Father Gen, and I were talking to the family on the phone. So as of 2 nights ago, she texted me back. She goes, Joe, it's gone dormant. And I said, well, my guess is that if it has, the wisdom of the ages, it knows who we are. It knows that we're ready to come out there and do battle if we have to. It's going dormant to try to tell you I'm gone now, so you don't have to talk to these guys anymore. We're way too smart for that. But I'm not going to go and kick the hornet's nest if there's nothing happening. So the children right now are at peace. They're not being bothered. The family's not experiencing anything supernatural. But I said, I don't care if it's 3:00 in the morning. If something happens, you let me know. I may not answer. I may not hear my phone, but you let me know. But we're ready to go at a moment's notice if we have to. And my gut's telling me at some point we're going to have to go to this place, and there's going to have to be a deliverance done. But if things are quiet, I'm not going to do that because you know what? We can go out there and do that and leave. We eventually have to go home, and then holy hell could break loose. That's why I don't want to kick that hornet's nest and then leave them, with the aftermath. Do you ever people do that though?
Do you ever face the issue that when you're getting ready to go for a real case that's dealing with something dark, maybe demonic, do things start trying to mess with you and the other investigators to keep you from even showing up?
Yeah, I've had cases where the car wouldn't start and stuff like that. And, they want to keep you from going there. Yeah.
Do they ever create issues? Now, again, we can mentally maybe say, oh, look, the car didn't start. That's probably the demon, or sometimes our cars don't start, right? But I mean, has there ever been an issue where you felt threatened physically, mentally, or somebody in your life that if I take on this case, this thing is already starting to target me?
Yeah, there's been times I've gotten ill. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I have a heart condition now. I'm not saying it's because of the work I've been doing, but it could be. It could be. I'd never be able to tell. I've had these conversations with my doctors, and they believe. And I said, look, I mean, this might sound crazy to you, but, I've got some health issues now that I probably shouldn't have at my age, but you never know. You never know. I truly believe that there are demonic forces at work and they want to keep us away. I remember Ed saying to me once, he's like, you know what, kid? He goes, the devil knows who we are and he hates us. Not only because we're human and we're made in the image of God, but because we're willing to stick up to him and spit in his eye, and that's not something that everyone should do. It can get pretty dangerous and you got to be smart about it.
It is a calling. It is a true calling for people that want to step into this line of work, especially when it comes to dealing with the demonic. I think what's important, and I'm sure you agree with this with the education aspect of what you do for people, is, be investigators, do that first line of defense. If you do start to discern and realize that what you're up against is something evil, malevolent, possibly demonic, that's when you need to turn it over to seasoned professionals that know what they're doing, that are actually trained in this and have been doing it, not just some weekend warrior who has watched all of the Exorcist movies back to back and now think that they're the new Father Merrin.
Yeah, because they can do far more harm than good. I mean, they may have the best interests at heart, but I've had countless cases where either the family themselves or the investigators have got a hold of me and say, Joe, we're out at this house. We think they have a portal somewhere and we got in over our heads. We don't know what to do. And I'll be like, you got to fill me in. Give me what you got, and I try to educate them without coming down on them too hard. And say, look, I know you meant well, but you might have made the situation worse. It's not cool to go into someone's house and mess with their emotions and their lives. And now, they're looking at you as the expert to help them, and you flee the house in terror because something happened and you can't explain it. And that's happened a lot through my lifetime is, Joe, we were out at a cemetery with a Ouija board and I think we got an attachment. And I'm like, what the heck are you doing out in the middle of a cemetery with a Ouija board for? It's just stupid. It's stupidity, if you ask me.
And that's what I want to cover in the next hour, right? How do people become victims of this? Some feel that they've been unceremoniously picked. They didn't do anything. They weren't playing with a Ouija board in the middle of a forest or a graveyard. They weren't doing it in their home or engaging, but something is there anyway. So I'd like to talk to you more about that in the next hour. In the last minute and a half here, again, you are involved and one of the people that the founders of the Warren Society for Paranormal Research and Education. Where can people find more information about that, Joe? And if they want to donate to help the cause so that you guys can continue to provide services to help people, how do they do that?
Well, I'm glad you asked. With the website is going to be launched soon. It's going to be warrensociety.com. And people could definitely donate if they like. We'd really appreciate it because that helps us do our work. Other than that, I mean, it just comes out of my pocket, and I'm happy to do it. Like I said, it's a vocation. It's not an occupation. But, I still got to keep the lights on here at home, too. But people can find me if they want to get in touch with me. You can get me at it's jfranke@warrensociety.com. Again, or you can go to joefrankeparanormal.com. I have my own little website, or get me on Facebook. If people need to reach out to me, just Google me. They can get a hold of me somehow.
Well, we've got our guest for another hour, and we will continue this discussion. And what brings the darkness? How do we make sure that the things that we're doing and the things that interest us and fascinate us do not make us prone for dark and malevolent hauntings, for demonic attachments and possible possession? That's next right here. He's not just a paranormal investigator. He's a first-hand witness to the legacy of renowned paranormal investigators and demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. You recognize those names, of course, from the famous Conjuring movie series. Our guest has spent 4 decades deep in the shadows. And joining us now on the John Schuster Coldwell Banker Hotline, Joe Franke returns with more chilling insights into the world where fear meets faith. So let's pull back the curtain right now on the Paranormal 360. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Joe Franke, let's talk about the concept of how do we get targeted? And does it always have to be something that we actually did? By me playing with a Ouija board in a cemetery, maybe doing some things like that, I can understand that being the first step. But what about families just move into a home and then everything goes crazy? What
I know
we look at there?
People, I tell people don't help the situation at all. when you're playing with forms of divination, and I have a big talk about divination, and one of the most common forms is Ouija boards. Ouija boards, seances, crystal balls, tarot cards, things like that. I said there's a difference between divination and a miraculous gift. So, for example, if you're a medium and you have a client and you get a message from the other side for that client, that's a gift. That's a miracle. I said, but if you're going around saying, "Now, give me the 6 lotto numbers for Friday night's drawing," no, it doesn't work that way. I ask people, don't play with this stuff, because if you play with fire, you're eventually going to get burned. Now, I'm not saying that just because you've ever used a Ouija board, you're going to have a problem, but why spin the wheel and take a chance? I talk about cases like the Exorcist case, Ronald Hunkler. That started out with a Ouija board. Then I talk about Annalise Michelle. Annalise Michelle was an innocent, beautiful, innocent 23-year-old girl, but she had a form of psychosis, a form of epilepsy. I forget what it was called. So that was the doorway. These things go after the weakest link. They were a very devout Catholic family. And she was going through medical testing. They tried many medications to help her. And you can have a psychological issue and a demonic issue. So we believe, or at least I believe, that doorway was this form of epilepsy that she had, and that's how it entered. And then the family, being devout Catholics, kind of gave up on the medicine, and they turned to the church. And then she ended up passing away of dehydration and malnutrition because she gave up. I mean, we all have free will, and it just got too overwhelming for her. These things beat the hell out of her, and it just wore her down where she gave up, So I talk about things like that, but you're right. You can be innocent and not partake in any of these things and still be a victim. I call them, victim soul. Maybe you've got a generational curse in your family that you had nothing to do with. We had a case out in Oklahoma a couple of years ago where the woman's grandmother and grandmother before her were into black magic and witchcraft and Ouija boards and all that stuff. And she was having all kinds of problems, And I remember one day we were on a Zoom call, because this is around the time of COVID. So I'm looking at her, and she would always be sitting in a dark room. And I said, I called her Mary. I'd say, "Mary, I need you to get up close to the camera. I need to see your eyes." And she was very resistant. She's like, "It won't let me. It won't let me." And I slammed my fist down. I said, "No, you have free will. You take control." I said, "Go turn the lights on in your bedroom and get your face up close to the camera." So after 5 or 10 minutes of coaxing, she finally did it. And I'm looking right at her eyes in the camera. And Dave, I kid you not, I can see 2 sets of pupils looking back at me. She had something within her. As God is my witness, I had never seen anything like that before. I just kind of sat back and like, okay, So what we were able to do is we were able to get this girl to the church, and the church took her under their wing, and we're working with her. But pretty much we were out of it at that point. We talked to the priest, and he's like, "Okay, we got it from here," kind of thing. But I still have members of my team that check in with her that live close to that area, and said she's doing pretty well, but she
Joe, let me ask you maybe a bit of a tougher question then, because obviously you're working in a religious way, as Ed and Lorraine did, and they worked closely with the church. They worked closely with priests. You bring up an interesting point. We have free will, but then we talk about things like generational curses. And we talk about, epilepsy as maybe being a chink in the armor that allows something in.
Right.
That's still not our free will. My medical condition should have nothing to do with what makes me susceptible to dark forces. And because my great grandmother practiced blah, blah, blah back in whatever year, my free will is that I'm trying to live a better life. I'm doing good. I'm not doing those practices. Why do you think that we're visited with that curse when it's against our free will?
That's a very good question. And so I guess it's all how you react to it. we have free will to look for help and ask for help. But when we try to offer that help, a lot of people, oh, I'm not going to do that, or I can't do that, or it won't let me do that. So you're right. These things come upon us, not because we asked for it, but now we have to do something about it. So we either choose to live with it or we choose not to do anything about it. I mean, I got off the phone with a guy 2 weeks ago. I was on the phone for him 2 hours, and he's telling me about all these things that are happening to him, and I'm giving him a lot of advice, and he's like, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm like, well, then what are you talking to me for then? I said, every piece of advice I've offered that where you can help yourself. I said, I can't come and show up with a proton pack on my back. It doesn't work that way. That's Hollywood. I said, you have to have skin in the game, and of your own free will, you need to take a stand and dig in and fight this, So it's a very good question. It's a hard one to answer. You're right. But it's how we react to things of our own free will. Like with Annalise Michelle, she stopped eating and drinking. The demons didn't force her to stop. She just gave up. I mean, I wasn't there, but I did a lot of research on the case, and I believe that's what happened.
Right. A true tragedy where it's connected to Annalise Michelle and other people that have faced that form of darkness. But that's the part that I think a lot of us that are skeptical believers struggle with, right? We want to believe that there's a good force, that there is a God, the universe, Gaia, whatever you want to call it, that keeps things in check. Yet we hear of innocence. We hear of people that are attacked. And I guess, according to the concept, that's what they want. They want the innocent. They want the pure. They want the religious. That's a bigger win to them than just Joe Blow at the bar who doesn't believe in God, doesn't have any faith in anything, and is a fall down drunk. He's easy to get, right? They kind of want the other. They want the others that are available to them.
You're right. But they'll take any soul they can get. They'll definitely. I mean, I tell people will ask me, well, why would God allow this to happen? I'm like, it's not up to us to question God. I said, I'm Roman Catholic, born and raised. I was taught by the Warrens, who are very Roman Catholic. But, I believe that your faith is your strength. Your faith is your weapon. I said, you can wear a cross around your neck. You can have holy water, a Bible. Those are just inanimate objects that mean nothing unless you believe in what they symbolize, unless you believe in the power that those things have,
All right, we have to take a break. We'll come back more with Joe Franke when we return. And are there any commonalities in the type of people that have these kind of darker issues? Family dysfunctionality, alcoholism, mental abuse? We'll talk about that next.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it that makes us vulnerable to the paranormal? Are we all capable of experiencing the paranormal? Is it really kind of a glorious miracle if we see things and we have that moment with grandma or grandpa after they've passed to give us that final nod and that message, that feeling of love before they make the final transition to the other side? That's all beauty. That's all gorgeous, right? And those are those happy feelings that Hollywood leaves us with. But what marks us for the darker entities? Our guest brought up epilepsy, and I know there are some of you that have probably raised an eyebrow saying, wait, what? But I know that has been a cornerstone of a lot of work in the paranormal field. Dr. Barry Taff, who worked with UCLA, and Dr. Thelma Moss at UCLA with the paranormal group there, they realized that a lot of people that had poltergeist-like activity or seemed prone to having paranormal activity around them, it was because that person worked as kind of a paranormal battery. And most of those people that were that paranormal battery, that source of energy, ended up having some form of epilepsy. And they found that in a lot of the clients that they worked with. We watch a lot of the shows and movies and documentaries, Joe, about cases, especially ones that the Warrens have worked on. And there is a lot of strife. There is anxiety. There's maybe a lot of children and very little money coming in. There's, everybody's buying a house at a bargain basement price because they can't afford life. Mm-hmm. Does that make us more susceptible because we have dysfunctionality, alcoholism, maybe drug abuse, physical and mental abuse in the family? Is that just putting you in the bullseye for malevolence?
I definitely believe so. I mean, when you've got any form of addiction, whether it be drugs, alcohol, it can be a pornography addiction, things like that. If you're Roman Catholic, in my opinion, anything that you put before God is against the first commandment. So that could be money, power, sex, whatever, stature, social stature. But you take a physical or psychological affliction and you couple that with some form of, it could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, a history of physical abuse. In the case of Maurice Theriault, where he was forced by his father in acts of bestiality and things like that. I'm still learning myself, even after 40 years. I don't think I'll ever have the answers in this lifetime. Maybe someday when I passed on to the great beyond. But I believe that these weaken us, and these negative forces. And I hate to sound like it's all negative, but that's kind of what I've been dealing with all these years. Is they're ready to pounce. I mean, they're there. They're just waiting for you to open that door and let them in. In these doorways. And I listen to a lot of. I met Father Gary Thomas. I don't know if you know Father Gary Thomas. He's out in the Sacramento area. He had a movie made about him, his life, called The Right, back in 2012. And I remember speaking to him. He helped me on a case in Vermont many years ago. And I asked him one day, I said, Father, do you mind if I ask you about this movie? How accurate was it to your life? And he said, it was very accurate, Joe. He goes, I was on set most days to make sure they got it right. So I learned a lot from those guys too. I listened to their lectures. Some of them I've talked to on the phone. I'm still learning. I don't know everything. I get stuck on things. I'll call someone like John, and say, John, what do you think about this? My mentors are gone now, unfortunately. I'm just trying to honor them with this work and keep it going, but it's hard when you're trying to pinpoint that doorway. You got to do a lot of digging, but you got to ask the right questions. And one question might lead to 10 more, but you want to ask the right questions. You don't want to just descend on someone's house with 12 people and a bunch of computers and cameras. And you go up in the basement, you go in the attic, you don't need that. That's not necessary. I've helped so many people throughout my life where I haven't even had to go to their house. I've just talked to them either on Messenger or on Zoom or whatever, and interview them and say, okay, try this, do this. I had a woman ask me in one of my lectures last year, goes, how come everything you talk about is negative and dark? I said, well, because that's what people want to hear. I said, but I've got a lot of stories where we've done what we call like the spirit rescue, where we'll try to ask a loved one from the other side to pull them over. Maybe they're confused or scared or feel they're not worthy, and we've got a lot of beautiful stories like that too. It's not all about the demonic, but that seems what people want to hear. And it's kind of what I got into with Ed, being he was a layman demonologist.
Right. Well, I mean, there's that element, right? That's why we love scary movies. That's why we love scary roller coasters. We love going to haunted houses during October, right? We love to do these things. Yep. There's kind of this thrill. You're never closer to living than when you are fearful for your own life or your own safety. Mm-hmm. So that's a really awkward kind of situation, because also having that kind of fascination, I don't think just watching movies and reading about that things makes you any more of a target necessarily, but when it becomes an obsession and you're hyper focused on just the evil all the time, that seems to me is where problems can start to arise, even in investigators' lives. I've watched people's lives crumble. Right. That got so hyper focused in that element that it became who they are instead of what they do or what they're there to help with.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned thrill seekers. I mean, look, at one point when I first started, I was interested in this, and I didn't know what I was doing. I loved going to cemeteries and taking pictures, and especially if you got something that you couldn't explain. And I show people pictures I've taken, 30 years ago. I said, look, I'm not telling you this is a ghost or a spirit, because that would be irresponsible of me. I don't know for sure. I said, I believe it's a form of energy, but if I'm standing out in the middle of a pasture, an old cemetery or something, I can't explain what this picture is per se. But, the thrill seekers, they go in like gangbusters, not really knowing what they're doing. And then they're surprised when something starts happening to them or their lives start to crumble, like you said. I'm like, well, you really shouldn't be doing this. It's not cool to mess around with this stuff,
Right.
but I'm just one guy. I'm a little voice. I'm just
Yeah, but you're the cautionary tale that shows that the people that fall into that line and maybe take things too far end up being the ones that pay the ultimate price. And not just for themselves, but for their family. They lose their family, they lose their jobs, and that obsession can break people. Have you ever had a concern or thought, you know what, I just need to step away from the paranormal for 2 years to cleanse my soul's palate?
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I have had discussions, and she'll tell me, she goes, even more recently with this other case, she's like, you're acting differently. And I'm like, yeah, at least I'm smart enough to know that I'm under diabolic attack sometimes. I'm not impervious to it. Again, as I said earlier, I'm just a human being, but I have people that help me ground myself and say, okay, sometimes I'll find myself getting angry, and that's what they want. They feed off that anger and that hostility. And I got to take a step back because that's not me. I'm a happy-go-lucky Irishman. I'm not an angry person. By nature.
Well, we're having a little contact communication. I think your phone's breaking up on us.
Sorry.
No problem. Joe Franke is our guest. He's here for another 2 segments with it. So we'll be with Joe till the top of the hour. Again, if this is the kind of topic that you're interested in, you'd like to know more, you can always email me, Dave at paranormal60. That's Dave at paranormal60.com. And tell me about the type of stories and things you'd like to hear us cover next on this program, because this show is about you. It's about opening up our minds, exploring, educating, enlightening, and entertaining you. But I also want to make sure that we are shining the spotlight into the darkest corners of these stories so that we know that as fascinating as they are, they can also bring a lot of problems. We'll be back with more right after this.
Have you ever felt like something or someone was trying to tell you something? That inner nudge, that quiet whisper from the universe, with intuition sharpened by years of spiritual connection and a deep-rooted gift. Winnie Schrader delivers readings that are compassionate, insightful, and shockingly accurate. Whether you're facing a crossroads healing from heartache, or just curious what the cards reveal, Winnie creates a safe, sacred space to explore your journey. This isn't fortune cookie fluff. This is honest, intuitive guidance from someone who's helped hundreds find clarity, closure, and confidence. If you've been waiting for a sign, this is it. Book your session now at lovelotustarot.com and take control of your journey. That's lovelotustarot.com. Winnie's sessions are personal, powerful, and often life-changing. That's lovelotustarot.com.
Joe Franke, our guest, and if you're interested in more information, their website is currently being built, the Warren Society for Paranormal Research and Education. And when it's fully up and running, I'll make sure that I share that link on an upcoming episode and let you know about it. This is the Paranormal 360, your home for all things strange and supernatural, every Sunday night, right here from 7 to 9 p.m. Central. Joe, I want to talk about another couple of your cases. I know listeners are going to want to know some of the specific things you've seen. And, it's dealer's choice. If you want to talk about some of the scarier ones or share a scary one and a beautiful story, we can do that too in these last couple of segments. But where would you like to take us next?
Well, I'd like to share a beautiful story, I think. This happened about 2 summers ago in my hometown here. My daughter had seen something on Facebook where a woman posted, and she said she was very reluctant to post because she thought people would start to ridicule her and make fun of her. But she had moved into a house about 3 years prior, and she started to have activity that she couldn't explain. And it was starting to scare her. They had a son who was about 6 or 8 months old, I believe, at the time. And the child was seeing things and would be like kind of scared and crying uncontrollably, like he was looking around the room following something. And so she put this up on Facebook, and it was one of those, I think it was one of those moms community group or something. And almost immediately, she had like 40 something comments. Oh, you need to call a priest, or you need to have an exorcism, or you need to do this, you need to do that. And my daughter jumped in and said, no, you need to call my dad. It just so happened that the woman lived about a quarter, maybe a half mile from me, right around the corner. And so I said to my daughter, I said, give her my phone number and have her call me. So within half an hour, she called me. And I just asked her, I said, well, what's going on? And she explained a little bit about, her son would be seeing these things. He was very young. Maybe he was more like a year. I don't remember. Forgive me. And, so I gave her some advice. I said, well, what's happened? How long have you lived there? Well, we've been here 3 years. Well, when did the activity start? Oh, just about a year ago. I said, well, let's go backwards in time and say, what happened within that time frame? Did you have a loss of any loved ones or anything like that? And she was like, yeah, my grandmother passed away. I said, well, do you have anything special in your home that belonged to your grandmother? She's like, well, we have her bedroom set that was passed down through the years and things like that. So I'm just kind of chipping away, asking questions. And my guess, and this is just my theory, but I said, you know what? After asking all the questions, I said, I think that it may be your grandmother coming to visit the baby, because she had passed while she was pregnant and she never got to see the baby. But she was appearing or allowing herself to be seen by the child, and it was scaring the child because he didn't know. And, so I basically said, listen, why don't you just try this? I said, just walk around the house like you're talking to me now in a normal voice and address your grandmother's spirit. Thank her for coming and visiting. But listen, please go on and rest in peace. You're scaring the child and, this, that, and the other thing. And I said, sometimes it's just that easy. That's all you have to do is just acknowledge their presence. Thank them for coming. She just wanted to come in visitation. So she's like, well, my grandmother didn't really speak English. She was Polish descent. Should I say it in Polish? Or I said, she'll understand you. It doesn't matter. So I said, and let me know how that makes out. So about a week goes by and she calls me up and she's like, Joe, what did you do? I said, I didn't do anything. Why? She says, well, everything's stopped. Now my son is sleeping now. There's no issues. I said, well, I didn't do anything. You did it, dear. I said, I just gave you some advice, So, and I still keep in touch with her. I talk to her every couple of months. I'll send her a note, and she's like, everything's fine now. Now, I don't really take credit for that. I just gave her a little friendly advice, but that's a beautiful story because if you have a loved one that comes in visitation, you get a newborn baby or something, that's a beautiful thing. So it's not all negative, and I didn't even have to go to the house. There was one night I was going to go to the house. Her husband got called into work. She's like, well, I'm going to be home. I said, well, no, you don't know me. I'm a big, dumb animal. I don't want you to come over and scare you. I said, out of respect, if your husband's not going to be there, we can reschedule. But it turned out that I never had to go over there. And by chance, I was at my doctor's office a couple months later. And I hear this voice. Is that Joe Franke? And around the corner comes this woman in a nurse's outfit, and it was her. I had never even met her. She just heard the name, and she gave me a big hug, and she started crying. And she said, thank you so much for helping me and my family. I said, I really didn't do much. I really didn't do anything, but that to me will always stick with me. And I've got similar stories like that, but those are the beautiful stories and they're not all dark and sinister and negative, because those can be pretty scary.
Joe, have you ever encountered somebody in the wild, just out and about, and when you come into contact with them, you realize this is somebody who is a host to something darker, not just a broken mind, but there is something in them?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. A recent case, I actually saw the guy's eyes turn black right in front of me.
Ooh.
And unfortunately, that gentleman, again, he has his own free will. He has embraced this rather than, renounced it. And there's nothing I can do. I said, if you're going to embrace this, there's nothing I can do to help you. So I gave him some advice. You don't want to take the advice. There's really not much I can do for you. But that's a more recent case. I had another case where this family, there was a lot of fighting going on. There was a sister-in-law that lived with her sister and her husband and children. And the sister-in-law and the husband of her sister hated each other. The brother-in-law and sister, they just hated each other. and they had a lot of activity going on where the children were being affected. And I told her, unless you guys can come to some agreement and come together and learn how to love one another, I'm not going to be able to help you. Nobody is, so that one didn't end too well. I think it ended up in a divorce, and the family's doing okay now, but at the time it was pretty ugly. So can't help everyone all the time.
Right. And we're going to take our final break in just a few moments here. We have about a minute and a half left. When you come into contact with somebody that okay, this is beyond ghosty, this is beyond a haunting, this is something trying to take possession of these people, does it always have to be demonic, or can it be an earthbound spirit?
Good question. No, it's not always demonic. Matter of fact, rarely it is. It could be outside influence of a negative spirit that once walked the earth, and there's a big difference, so, you get a human spirit. Usually if you're a jerk in life, maybe you're a jerk in death, and you can have influence, human spirits can have an impact on your environment. They can touch you, they can scratch you, they can move objects, but they certainly, in my opinion, can't pick me up and throw me across the room.
Right.
I hope not.
All right, we have one last segment together. Man, these shows go by fast. Joe Franke, our guest, and again, he is the curator and founder for the Warren Society of Paranormal Research and Education, named, of course, after his mentors, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who most of you probably are familiar with now due to the Conjuring movies. We're going to take our final break. We'll come back. I want to talk a little bit about, as we wrap up here, how close to what we see in the movies is a true possession? Are people floating? Are their heads twisting? Are they speaking foreign languages and in gruff voices? Or is that an indicator that you're dealing with somebody with mental issues? Let's just put it politely. If they start talking like this and blah, blah, is that just their training from what they've seen in the movies? We'll talk to Joe Franke more about that when we return. I'm Dave Schrader, and this is the Paranormal 360. All right, Joe, lay it on us, my friend. What is it like in a real possession case as opposed to things that we've seen in the movies? And I know that like the possession of Emily Rose, which is based on the Annalise Michel case, and The Exorcist are based on actual stories, but hands-on, boots on the ground, you've witnessed deliverance, you've seen exorcisms. How close is Hollywood to getting it right?
Some of them are not. Some of them are well done. I mean, The Exorcist was pretty well done. There's a movie recently called Nefarious that I believe was pretty spot on. I remember assisting in an exorcism with Bishop McKenna, God rest his soul, one time, and I remember he said he would meet with us before going out into the church where the afflicted person was waiting. And he says, no matter what happens, no matter what it does or what it says, he didn't say he or she, it. He's talking about, the manifestation of the demon. He said, don't look at it, don't address it, don't say anything, just continue to look away and pray. We were there to protect the person and the bishop from being attacked. The head spinning around stuff like you see in the movie, that didn't happen. That doesn't happen because it would have killed the person. Okay, these demons or fallen angels, I should say, they're that's because that's what they are on a very short leash. They can only do what God allows. So and God will allow a lot, and only He knows why. We shouldn't be questioning Him, but
but yet faces. People have said exorcists have talked about faces changing. You've seen the eyes turn black. We've seen the words carved into the flesh of people, right? Ed and Lorraine even witnessed things like that. So there is this physical manipulation. So some of that is true and right from the actual Book of Rites and what the clergy have seen and dealt with.
You're absolutely right. So I've seen people's eyes turn black. I've seen them turn into what look like a serpent's eyes. Their facial distortions. They'll have wounds open up sporadically and just start bleeding. Absolutely, these things do manifest. But when you get into, levitation, I've never seen levitation myself, In speaking to some exorcist friends that I know are exorcists, they said that's very rare. And all these parlor tricks, so to speak, are meant to scare you. Okay. And to the average human being, it would, I remember Father Carlos Martins, when I was talking to him one time, and he said that you see this once or twice, yeah, it scares you, but after you see it 100 times, because these demons they're very they're very prone to doing the same antics, And he says then you just kind of dismiss it, but the eyes will turn green. They'll look like a lizard or a serpent. They'll turn black. The body will contort. That really does happen. I've seen it.
You cast these out, right? The priests, the exorcist cast this thing out. Does it just launch across the street and start mucking with the McHenry family, or is it being put back in hell? Is it being sent somewhere where it can't do damage again?
Well, I know that, I've been involved with, in an exorcism once where I remember Bishop McKenna said, I command you, or in the name of Jesus Christ, in the blood of Christ, to go to the foot of the cross and accept your fate. And there are times I believe that if it is cast out, it's going to look for another host. So if there is someone nearby that is not in a state of grace, and it does form some kind of bond with it, even by looking at it. That's why I'd say don't look at it, don't address it, don't say anything to it. You could become the next victim. Yeah, I believe that. Wow. I don't think it goes bouncing down the street like maybe in the movie Fallen, I think it was, but some of these movies are pretty accurate. If
you ever encounter the same evil? Have you bumped something out and 10 years later run into that same manifestation?
Same kind of it? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's same kind, albeit different. And a lot of these things, a lot of times you have what we call legion. You'll have many. You won't just have one demon. It sometimes it'll come back with friends. It's hard to explain, and it's very scary. And I just want your audience to know, don't mess with this stuff unless you're trained on how to do it, because it's not pretty, it's not fun, it's not cool, and you can get very hurt. You or someone you love can be devastated.
And let's clarify. If you've been trained by a 6-week online course and you've never met the person that's training you, probably also not the safest $150 you've ever spent, right?
Exactly. These online courses, no, absolutely not. These online exorcism courses. Now I'm an exorcist. No, you're not. Why would you want to be? I don't get it. Why would you want to be? Like I said, for me, this was a calling. I was chosen. I didn't choose it. It chose me. And does it scare me? Yeah, I'm scared. I'm human. But, I would say I'm more apprehensive. I respect the power of this stuff. I know the power it has. I know what it can do. I know it can destroy me. It could tear me apart. It could eat me for lunch. But my faith is what protects me, and I'm not a holy roller, to be honest with you, but I'm very strong in my faith. And I coined the phrase from the movie Miracle on 34th Street. Faith is believing in something that common sense tells you not to. You have to have faith in something, and, like they say, there's no atheists in foxholes. Well, there's no atheists in haunted houses either.
Right. People that have maybe not had a belief in that kind of thing quickly become believers, right? All skeptics are just a believer who has yet to have their own experience. And that's an important element of this. I appreciate what you're doing, Joe, and I appreciate that you're keeping the legacy of the Warrens alive and that you're educating people, helping families out there. Thank you for the continued work that you do in their name.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
And we'll talk again. I'd like to hear more about it. And as soon as the website's up, we will alert you folks so that way you can go check it out and educate yourself, learn more about this. Because, whether you were brought into the Warrens world by their movies or by their books or by happenstance, educate yourself on the people that were there at the beginning, of the Hans Holzers, of the Ed and Lorraine Warrens, of the Dr. William Rolls, of the Dr. Thelma Moss, and others that have been the forerunners in the paranormal field, opening these doors, educating us. This is not just something that should be taken lightly. It should never be something looked at as just a fun weekend activity. So you've got to be careful. And it's been a crazy ride, my Darklings. But Joe Franke didn't just bring stories. He brought history, experience, and a warning. The paranormal isn't a playground. It's real, it's dangerous, and it demands respect. You can learn more about Joe and his work with the Warren Society for Paranormal Research and Education by visiting the link that we've talked about in tonight's show. And big thanks to Joe for joining us tonight, sharing his wisdom from a lifetime spent on the front lines of the unknown. So until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, it's okay to leave the lights on.